The drone hovered 20 feet above my bride as she walked down the aisle. Its mechanical whirring drowned out the wedding march, while Sheriff Corinne stood at the property line with a twisted smile on her face. My hands were shaking as I watched my fiancée's tears of joy turn to confusion and fear. The guests were looking up at the sky instead of celebrating our love. That was the moment I knew Corinne had crossed a line she could never uncross. And that was when I made the call that would change everything. 6 months before that terrible day, Marcus and I were living in what felt like a fairy tale. We had found the perfect spot for our wedding on my family's ranch in Cedar Valley. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, with rolling hills and oak trees that seemed designed by nature herself for outdoor celebrations. Marcus was not your typical groom. He worked as a professional falconer and ran a wildlife rehabilitation center just outside of town. His passion for birds of prey had started in childhood and grown into a career that brought injured raptors back to health. I loved watching him work with the hawks, eagles, and falcons that came to his facility. There was something magical about seeing these powerful creatures trust him completely. Our wedding plans were simple but beautiful. We wanted an outdoor ceremony under the ancient oak tree where my grandparents had been married 50 years earlier. Marcus had arranged for aerial photography to capture the sweeping views of the valley from above. Everything would be perfect and legal. We spent weeks getting all the proper permits from the county. The gathering permit, the temporary structure permit for our reception tent, even the special photography permit for the aerial shots. We dotted every I and crossed every T because we believed in doing things the right way. That was when I first met Sheriff Corinne Williams. She walked into the county office while we were filing our final paperwork. Her uniform was pressed to military precision, and her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. She looked at our wedding permits like they were written in a foreign language. "What kind of fancy city wedding are you planning out there?" Corinne asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Just a simple outdoor ceremony," I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Everything is properly permitted." Corinne's eyes narrowed as she studied the documents. "We will see about that. These permits do not mean you can do whatever you want on that property. I will be keeping an eye on things." Marcus squeezed my hand as we left the office that day. Something about Corinne's tone had sent a chill down both our spines. We should have trusted that instinct. 2 weeks after our encounter at the county office, Corinne began her campaign of harassment. It started small, the way these things always do. She showed up at the ranch claiming she needed to conduct a routine safety inspection of our wedding venue. She arrived with a clipboard and a measuring tape, looking for violations that did not exist. Corinne questioned the distance between our ceremony site and the property line. She measured the width of our gravel driveway and declared it might not meet emergency vehicle access standards. Every tree branch became a potential hazard. Every electrical outlet needed additional documentation. "You city folks always think you can come into our town and do whatever you please," Corinne said as she scribbled notes on her clipboard. "But I run a tight ship in Cedar Valley." Marcus and I exchanged glances. We had lived in this town for 3 years. This was hardly our first day here. The harassment escalated quickly. Corinne began visiting our wedding vendors with surprise inspections and manufactured violations. Our caterer suddenly needed additional permits that had never existed before. Our florist was told her delivery truck was too large for residential roads. Our musician received a warning about noise ordinances during what Corinne called quiet hours that seemed to change daily. Each visit from Corinne felt like psychological warfare. She would arrive unannounced, usually during dinner or early morning hours, claiming she had received anonymous complaints about our wedding preparations. The complaints were always vague and impossible to verify. "Someone called about excessive noise," she would say, even when Marcus and I were quietly reading on the porch. "Someone reported suspicious activity," she would claim, when our only activity was watering the garden. Marcus began researching Corinne's background. What he discovered made our situation much clearer and much worse. Corinne had been pressuring my family to sell the ranch for over 2 years. She had connections with a development company that wanted to build a shopping center on our land. Our family had refused every offer, and Corinne had taken our rejection personally. The pieces fell into place like a sinister puzzle. This was not about wedding permits or noise ordinances. This was about revenge and greed. One evening, as Marcus and I sat on the porch discussing final wedding details, we heard an unfamiliar sound above us, a mechanical whirring that seemed out of place in our peaceful valley. We looked up to see a small drone hovering about 50 feet above our house. The drone circled our property for nearly an hour before disappearing into the darkness. Marcus and I sat in silence, both understanding that our private sanctuary had been violated in a way that felt deeply personal. "She is watching us," I whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. His jaw was set in a way I had learned to recognize. It was the same expression he wore when working with his most aggressive birds, patient but determined, ready for whatever came next. The drone flights became a daily occurrence. Every morning at sunrise, Corinne's mechanical spy would appear above our property. It would hover over our breakfast table on the patio. It would follow me when I walked to the mailbox. It would circle Marcus when he worked with his birds in the flight pens behind the rehabilitation center. The constant surveillance was psychological torture. We could not have a private conversation in our own backyard. We could not enjoy a quiet moment without the mechanical whirring above our heads. The drone's camera lens felt like a cold eye watching our every move. Corinne escalated her official harassment as well. She began issuing citations for violations that existed only in her imagination. Our wedding would exceed gathering size limits, she claimed, despite our permit clearly stating the approved number of guests. Our planned music would violate noise ordinances that she seemed to invent on the spot. The most outrageous incident came when Corinne threatened to arrest our wedding photographer for operating a commercial business without proper licensing. Sarah had been photographing weddings in Cedar Valley for over 10 years with all the correct permits and insurance. But Corinne declared that our aerial photography plans constituted some kind of aviation violation. "No unauthorized aircraft over my jurisdiction," Corinne announced during her visit. "That includes photography drones." Marcus pointed out that we had obtained aerial photography permits from both the county and the FAA. Corinne dismissed our documentation with a wave of her hand. "Federal permits do not override local authority," she said with a smirk that made my skin crawl. The constant drone surveillance was affecting Marcus's work with the rehabilitation birds. Raptors are sensitive to mechanical sounds and unfamiliar objects in their territory. The red-tailed hawks in his care became agitated and refused to hunt during their training sessions. His prized peregrine falcon, Thunder, would screech and strike at the flight pen walls whenever the drone appeared. "These birds know when something is wrong," Marcus explained to me one evening as we watched Thunder pace anxiously in his enclosure. "They can sense a threat even when they cannot fight it." I understood exactly how Thunder felt. Our research into Corinne's motivations revealed the full scope of her corruption. She had been using her position as sheriff to pressure property owners throughout the valley. Families who refused to sell to her developer friends found themselves facing constant harassment through bogus citations, surprise inspections, and mysterious complaints from anonymous sources. Karen had turned law enforcement into a personal weapon for real estate speculation. Our wedding had simply given her a new excuse to intensify the pressure on my family's ranch. The breaking point came during our wedding rehearsal. As our families gathered under the oak tree to practice the ceremony, Karen's drone appeared directly overhead. It hovered so low that the mechanical noise made it impossible to hear the officiant's instructions. Marcus looked up at the drone with an expression I had never seen before. His years of working with predatory birds had taught him to read aerial behavior better than anyone. He understood territory disputes and dominance displays in ways that most people never would. "That is not surveillance anymore," he said quietly. "That is a direct challenge." As we stood there with our confused families, watching the drone circle above our rehearsal like a mechanical vulture, I realized that Corinne had declared war on our happiness. She was not content to harass us behind the scenes. She wanted to destroy our wedding day itself. That night, Marcus began preparing his birds for something I had never imagined possible. Our wedding morning dawned clear and beautiful, with golden sunlight streaming through the oak trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the valley. For the first few hours, I allowed myself to believe that maybe Corinne would leave us alone on our special day. I was wrong. At 7 in the morning, while I was having coffee with my bridesmaids and trying to calm my pre-wedding nerves, we heard the familiar mechanical whirring above the house. But this time, it was not just one drone. There were 3 of them, circling our property like mechanical vultures waiting for something to die. My maid of honor, Jessica, pointed at the kitchen window with a look of disbelief. "Are those police drones at your wedding?" I felt my stomach drop as I watched the surveillance devices hover above our ceremony site. They were positioned to capture every angle of our wedding preparations. The mechanical noise was constant and invasive, turning our peaceful morning into something that felt like a military operation. Marcus arrived from the rehabilitation center looking grim but determined. He had spent the early morning hours working with his birds, preparing them for what he hoped would not be necessary. "She is not going to stop," he said as we watched the drones through the bedroom window. "This is her final play." At 10:30, just as our guests began arriving for the noon ceremony, Sheriff Corinne's patrol car pulled up at our front gate. She emerged wearing her full uniform with what looked like military gear attached to her belt. 2 deputies followed her, both looking uncomfortable with whatever orders they had received. Corinne marched across our property like she owned it, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of smug authority that made my blood boil. "I have received multiple noise complaints about this gathering," she announced loudly enough for our arriving guests to hear. "This wedding is in violation of several county ordinances." My father stepped forward with our permits in hand. "Officer, we have all the proper documentation for this event." Corinne barely glanced at the paperwork. "These permits do not override public safety concerns. I have authority to shut down any gathering that presents a risk to the community." The timing was no accident. Corinne had waited until our guests were present to maximize the humiliation. She wanted witnesses to her power play. She wanted our families and friends to see her authority over our most important day. As our ceremony time approached, the drones descended lower. They hovered directly above the altar where Marcus and I were supposed to exchange vows. The mechanical whirring was so loud that our officiant had to shout to be heard. Our guests looked up at the sky instead of focusing on our ceremony. Children pointed at the drones with confusion. Elderly relatives shook their heads in disapproval. This was not the peaceful celebration we had planned for months. When Marcus and I took our positions under the oak tree, Corinne positioned herself at the edge of our ceremony site with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She was enjoying every moment of our humiliation. The officiant began speaking, but his words were nearly drowned out by the mechanical noise above us. I could see the frustration and anger on Marcus's face as he looked up at the drones circling our wedding like mechanical predators. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today," the officiant shouted over the drone noise. That was when Corinne made her final move. She stepped forward with her clipboard raised like a weapon. "I am shutting down this gathering immediately," she announced. "You are in violation of emergency noise ordinances and unauthorized aircraft restrictions." The drones descended even lower, their cameras pointing directly at Marcus and me as we stood at the altar. Our wedding vows were being interrupted by a corrupt sheriff's power trip. Marcus looked at me with eyes full of love and determination. Then he looked up at the drones with an expression I recognized from his work with predatory birds. It was the look of a hunter who had found his prey. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small whistle. Our guests probably thought it was part of some wedding tradition they did not understand. But I knew better. That whistle was Marcus's recall signal for his trained raptors. He put the whistle to his lips and blew 3 sharp notes that cut through the drone noise like a blade. The response was immediate and magnificent. Thunder, Marcus's prized peregrine falcon, appeared first. He came from the direction of the rehabilitation center like a feathered missile, his wings cutting through the air with deadly precision. Peregrine falcons are the fastest creatures on Earth when they dive, and Thunder had been trained to respond to Marcus's whistle from distances that most people would consider impossible. The first drone never had a chance. Thunder struck it with the force of a guided missile, his talons finding purchase on the plastic housing while his wings beat furiously to maintain control. The drone's mechanical whirring changed to a grinding, broken sound as Thunder's grip crushed delicate components. Our wedding guests gasped and then began to cheer as the first drone crashed into the flower arrangements beside our altar. Sparks flew from broken circuits, while Thunder landed gracefully on a nearby fence post, looking completely satisfied with his work. But Thunder was not alone. 2 red-tailed hawks appeared next, diving from the oak trees where they had been waiting for Marcus's signal. These were birds that Marcus had rehabilitated and released, but they still responded to his call when he needed them. Their hunting instincts had been sharpened by their time in the wild, and they attacked the remaining drones with coordinated precision. The second drone tried to climb higher to escape, but the red tails were faster and smarter. They worked together, one bird distracting the drone while the other struck from below. The mechanical device spun out of control and crashed into the reception tent, sending our wedding cake toppling to the ground. Our guests were on their feet now, cheering and applauding as nature reclaimed the sky above our wedding. Children clapped their hands while adults pointed and laughed at the aerial battle unfolding above us. But the most spectacular moment came when Marcus's golden eagle, Talon, arrived for the final assault. Golden eagles are massive birds with wingspans that can reach 8 feet. Talon was Marcus's oldest and strongest bird, a magnificent creature that had been with the rehabilitation center for over 5 years. When he appeared above our ceremony, his shadow darkened the entire altar area. The third drone was larger and more expensive than the others, with multiple rotors and what looked like professional camera equipment. Karen had saved her best surveillance device for last, but she had not counted on facing a predator that had ruled the skis for millions of years. Talon struck the drone with such force that the impact was audible throughout the valley. The mechanical device disintegrated in midair, its pieces raining down like metallic confetti while Talon soared triumphantly overhead. The silence that followed was profound and beautiful. For the first time in weeks, our property was free from mechanical whirring. The only sounds were natural ones: wind through the oak trees, birds singing in the distance, and the cheers of our wedding guests. Karen stood at the edge of our ceremony with her mouth open in shock. Her expensive surveillance equipment was scattered in pieces across our wedding venue. Her deputies were trying not to smile as they watched their boss's technology defeated by nature itself. "You destroyed police equipment," Karen screamed, her face red with rage and humiliation. "That is a federal crime. I will have you arrested for terrorism." Marcus stepped forward with thunder perched calmly on his glove. The peregrine falcon's yellow eyes were fixed on Karen with the intensity of a natural predator evaluating potential prey. "Those drones were violating FAA flight restrictions over private property," Marcus said calmly. "My birds were simply defending their territory from unauthorized aircraft." Our guests erupted in applause again. Karen's own deputies were struggling to maintain their composure as they watched their boss's authority crumble along with her surveillance drones. But I could see the fury in Karen's eyes, and I knew this victory would come with a price. She had been humiliated in front of an entire community, and people like Karen never forgave that kind of public defeat. As she stormed back to her patrol car, shouting threats about federal charges and terrorism investigations, I realized that our real battle was just beginning. Karen's revenge came swiftly, and with the full weight of federal bureaucracy behind it. 3 days after our wedding, FBI agents appeared at Marcus's rehabilitation center with a warrant for his arrest. The charges were as serious as they were absurd: destruction of federal aircraft, interference with law enforcement operations, and domestic terrorism related to training animals as weapons. I watched in horror as they handcuffed my new husband in front of his bird enclosures. The raptors in his care screeched and beat their wings against the mesh walls, sensing the distress of their caretaker. Thunder, still in his flight pen, called out with the piercing cry that had become the soundtrack to our resistance. "This is insane," I told the lead agent as they prepared to take Marcus away. "Those were police drones illegally surveilling our private wedding." The agent was polite but unmoved. "Ma'am, interfering with law enforcement aircraft is a federal offense regardless of the circumstances. Your husband will have his day in court." Karen stood behind the federal agents with the same smug expression she had worn throughout our ordeal. She had managed to turn our act of defiance into a federal case, and she was savoring every moment of our terror. The potential consequences were devastating. If convicted on terrorism charges, Marcus could face decades in federal prison. Even if the charges were reduced, his wildlife rehabilitation license would be permanently revoked. The center that had been his life's work would be shut down, and the birds in his care would be relocated or euthanized. But something unexpected happened in the days following Marcus's arrest. Our wedding guests began sharing their videos and photos of the drone attack on social media. The footage showed clearly that Karen's surveillance devices had been harassing a private wedding ceremony on private property. The story spread quickly through Cedar Valley and beyond. Local news stations picked up the footage of trained raptors destroying police drones while wedding guests cheered in the background. The visual symbolism was powerful. Nature versus technology, individual rights versus government overreach, love versus petty tyranny. Our wedding guests became witnesses and advocates. They organized a legal defense fund and hired the best civil rights attorney in the state. More importantly, they began sharing their own stories about Corinne's harassment campaign. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the bakery downtown, revealed that Corinne had threatened to shut down her business after she refused to support the sheriff's political campaign. The Martinez family shared documents showing how Corinne had harassed them with bogus citations after they declined to sell their farm to developers. A pattern emerged that went far beyond our wedding drama. Corinne had been using her badge to terrorize anyone who opposed her personal interests or political agenda. Our case had simply provided the spotlight that illuminated her systematic corruption. The investigation into Corinne's conduct began when a county auditor noticed discrepancies in the police department's equipment purchases. The drones used to harass our wedding had been bought with taxpayer money, but were not registered as official police equipment. Corinne had been using public funds to purchase personal surveillance devices. Federal investigators discovered that Corinne had been operating an unauthorized surveillance program, targeting political opponents and property owners who refused to cooperate with her real estate schemes. The drones she had used against us were just the tip of an iceberg of corruption that reached deep into the sheriff's department. Marcus's case took an unexpected turn when the FBI's own investigation revealed that Corinne's drones had been operating in violation of multiple federal aviation regulations. They had been flying below minimum altitudes over private property without proper clearances. Ironically, Corinne's own illegal surveillance activities had undermined her case against Marcus. The community support continued to grow. Business owners who had been terrorized by Corinne began speaking publicly about their experiences. Deputies from her own department provided anonymous testimony about orders they had been given to harass specific individuals for personal rather than professional reasons. Media attention brought national awareness to our story. The footage of Marcus's raptors destroying the drones became a viral symbol of resistance against government overreach. News commentators debated the legal implications, while internet memes celebrated the victory of trained birds over mechanical surveillance. But the most important development came when federal prosecutors began questioning the legitimacy of the charges against Marcus. With mounting evidence of Corinne's corruption and the illegal nature of her surveillance program, the case against my husband looked increasingly like a vindictive prosecution rather than legitimate law enforcement. The federal investigation into Sheriff Corinne Williams became the biggest corruption scandal in Cedar Valley's history. What started as a case against Marcus quickly transformed into a comprehensive audit of Corinne's entire tenure as sheriff. Federal investigators discovered a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden beneath the veneer of small-town law enforcement. The drone program was just one piece of Corinne's illegal surveillance operation. Phone records revealed that she had been coordinating with developers to identify properties for forced acquisition. Families who refused to sell would suddenly find themselves facing harassment campaigns disguised as law enforcement activities. Corinne's financial records told the complete story. She had received regular payments from Pinnacle Development Corporation in exchange for pressuring property owners to sell their land. The company wanted to build shopping centers and housing developments throughout the valley, and Karen had been using her badge to eliminate resistance. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Karen had been falsifying police reports to create paper trails that justified her harassment campaigns. She had invented criminal violations and safety concerns that existed only in her imagination. Our wedding permits had been perfectly legal, but Karen had planned to claim violations regardless of our compliance. The most damning evidence came from her own deputies. Detective Ray Morrison, who had worked under Karen for 8 years, finally broke his silence about the orders he had been given. She told us to find reasons to cite anyone on her target list, Morrison testified during the federal hearing. It did not matter if they were actually breaking the law. She wanted documentation that could be used to pressure them into selling their property. Deputy Sarah Chen provided additional testimony about Karen's abuse of federal law enforcement resources. The terrorism charges against Marcus had been fabricated to create leverage in what was essentially a real estate dispute. Sheriff Williams instructed us to describe the wedding incident as an attack on law enforcement aircraft, Chen testified. She wanted federal charges because local prosecutors were starting to question her methods. The FBI's technical analysis of the drone footage provided the final nail in Karen's coffin. The surveillance devices had been operating in clear violation of FAA regulations governing flight altitude, privacy restrictions, and law enforcement use of unmanned aircraft. Marcus's birds had actually been responding to illegal surveillance that violated multiple federal laws. The terrorism charges against my husband were not just unjustified. They were an attempt to criminalize legitimate self-defense against illegal government surveillance. Federal prosecutors formally dropped all charges against Marcus on a Tuesday morning in November. I was in the courtroom when the announcement was made, and I watched my husband's shoulders relax for the first time in months. The government moves to dismiss all charges against Marcus Chen, the prosecutor announced. Subsequent investigation has revealed that the defendant was responding to illegal surveillance activities that violated his Fourth Amendment rights. Karen's downfall accelerated rapidly after that. The County Board of Supervisors called for her immediate resignation, while state prosecutors filed criminal charges for corruption, fraud, and civil rights violations. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, phone logs, falsified police reports, and testimony from multiple deputies painted a picture of systematic corruption that had lasted for over 5 years. Pinnacle Development Corporation was also investigated for their role in the scheme. Corporate emails revealed explicit discussions about using Karen's position to pressure property owners. The company had been paying Karen to use her law enforcement authority as a tool for real estate acquisition. The civil rights violations were particularly serious. Federal prosecutors charged Karen with using her official position to deny citizens their constitutional rights to due process and protection from unreasonable searches. The drone surveillance of our wedding was classified as an illegal search conducted without warrants or probable cause. Karen's resignation letter was brief and bitter. She blamed outside agitators and federal overreach for her downfall, refusing to acknowledge the corruption that had been documented in overwhelming detail. But the community knew better. Business owners who had been terrorized by Karen's harassment campaigns finally felt safe to speak publicly about their experiences. Property owners shared stories about bogus citations and invented violations that had been used to pressure them into selling their land. The rehabilitation of Marcus's reputation was swift and complete. Wildlife authorities not only reinstated his licenses, but commended him for his actions in defending private property against illegal surveillance. His story became a case study in civil disobedience and the protection of constitutional rights. Thunder, Talon, and the red-tailed hawks who had destroyed Corinne's drones became local celebrities. Children would visit the rehabilitation center just to see the birds that had defeated the corrupt sheriff's surveillance program. But the most satisfying moment came when Corinne was led away in handcuffs, just as Marcus had been months earlier. The difference was that her arrest was based on genuine crimes with overwhelming evidence of guilt. Corinne Williams was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The judge's words during sentencing captured the gravity of her crimes and the damage she had inflicted on our community. You used the badge and authority entrusted to you by the citizens of Cedar Valley to terrorize innocent families for personal financial gain, Judge Martinez said as Corinne stood before the bench in an orange jumpsuit. You perverted the very concept of law enforcement and betrayed the public trust in the most fundamental way possible. I sat in the courtroom gallery with Marcus, watching justice finally prevail. Corinne showed no remorse during the proceedings, maintaining her innocence even as overwhelming evidence documented her corruption. But her defiance could not change the reality of her crimes or the consequences she would face. The civil lawsuits followed quickly. Our family sued Corinne and Pinnacle Development Corporation for harassment, illegal surveillance, and violation of our civil rights. The damages we received were substantial, but more importantly, they sent a message that corruption would not be tolerated in Cedar Valley. Other families who had been terrorized by Corinne's harassment campaigns filed their own lawsuits. The total legal settlements exceeded $2 million, money that would help rebuild the lives that Corinne had tried to destroy. Marcus and I finally took our honeymoon 6 months after our wedding. We traveled to Costa Rica, where Marcus studied tropical bird rehabilitation techniques while I relaxed on beaches free from mechanical surveillance. The skis were clear and natural, filled only with the birds that belonged there. When we returned to Cedar Valley, we found a community transformed by our experience. The new sheriff, elected with unprecedented community involvement, implemented transparency measures and accountability systems that would prevent another Corinne Williams from abusing power. Marcus expanded his wildlife rehabilitation center with funding from our legal settlement. The facility became a model for raptor conservation and education, attracting visitors from across the country who wanted to see the birds that had become symbols of resistance against tyranny. Thunder, now 7 years old, remained the star of the rehabilitation center. Children would listen in amazement as Marcus told the story of how the peregrine falcon had defended our wedding against mechanical invaders. The bird seemed to understand his celebrity status, preening proudly whenever visitors gathered around his enclosure. The golden eagle Talon became an education ambassador, helping Marcus teach school groups about wildlife conservation and the importance of protecting natural habitats from development. The irony was perfect. The bird who had destroyed Corinne's surveillance drones now helped protect the valley from the very developers who had corrupted our former sheriff. Our story became a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and a celebration of community resistance to corruption. Universities used our case in criminal justice courses, while civil rights organizations cited our experience as an example of how ordinary citizens could fight back against government overreach. But the most meaningful outcome was personal. Marcus and I had learned that love and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Our wedding day had been interrupted by a corrupt sheriff's power trip, but our marriage had been strengthened by the battle we fought together. On quiet evenings, we would sit on our porch and watch Marcus's birds soar over the valley. The sky was clear and natural again, free from mechanical intruders. Thunder would call out from his perch, his piercing cry echoing across the hills like a victory song. Corinne Williams had tried to destroy our happiness and steal our land. Instead, she had united our community, exposed her own corruption, and created a legacy of resistance that would protect Cedar Valley for generations to come. Sometimes the good guys really do win.